The Mediterranean is actually a very warm body of water, and it's not a great place to fish for the most part. And they did...
What? Go tell that to the Sicilians. I'm very critical of extremism on both sides of the political spectrum.
The Greeks were very open to same-sex relationships. So for them, the best form of same-sex relationship, an older man who was married and had a family with a teenage boy.
Like, the truth is not acceptable, so we're not going to tell it that way. That's when you're going to have a problem with me. And that's why I'm going to keep making these videos, to protect the truth. It's all over the sources. These professors keep skipping that. I don't care, because I don't have to play by the rules of Wired. I'll repeat it. Wired. Oh, noble ones, are you excited to go back to ancient Greece? But maybe your answer will be yes. But when it comes to me, considering the fact that Wired, Wired is what we are watching, then it really depends. I mean, oftentimes I've had trouble with Wired. They had this Viking expert who was really good, and then they had this ancient Roman expert who was not very good because she was pushing a lot of politics. In fact, there is a lot of politics on this channel that is pushed in a way that I don't think should be pushed, but maybe today they'll surprise me. But in case they don't, I came armed with some Lindt chocolate, not a sponsor. So yeah, I'll bring some sweetness into my life because goodness gracious. Wired. But let's see.
Hi, I'm Professor Paul Christensen. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Ancient Greece Support.
Let's go. Professor. Professor.
Adzugati69. So did ancient Greeks really just walk around naked all the time? Or are the people who made those statues and paintings just super horny? The Greeks did not walk around naked all the time. But the one time that it was socially acceptable
Olympics.
to be nude in public was when we were working out in a gym. And in fact, that comes from a good Greek word, gymnasion, literally the nude place. So they're not enthusiasts for public nudity by any stretch of the imagination. Really fit bodies were a sign of being sound of character. Like
Right.
you were a good moral person if you were in really good physical condition.
It's a little bit similar to the mens sana in corpore sano approach, I guess.
And you wanted to see their body so you could tell that they were in great physical shape, so they needed to be nude. At Bite Size Dancy 1, how accurate is the movie 300? The movie
It's fantasy.
300 is pretty accurate in a lot of ways. A lot of it's embellishment, but there are some things which are pretty much right on the mark.
Well, one thing about 300, I'm kind of surprised that he said that because it's not. It really isn't, Professor. I mean, with all due respect, you're the expert. So maybe I'm full of nonsense in this case. I want to see how he defends it. Maybe he's just very positive, and so he sees 57 things that are wrong, and then he sees 7 things that are right, and he has the ability, contrary to me, to focus on the positive and be like, no, it's pretty accurate. Yeah, they do like bodybuilders without armor, even though the Spartans were the most armored of all the Greeks. But hey, maybe, maybe that's just me. To be honest, it's not even based on the history. Obviously, it's not accurate. It's based on the comics. So, I mean, he's the professor, so let's see.
The film is based on a graphic novel by Frank Miller. The single most famous scene, the Persian ambassador comes to Sparta and asks for earth and water.
A simple offering of earth and water.
Just a symbolic submission, and Persians did actually do that. The Spartans did throw the ambassador in a well. There are Spartan boys being sent out into the wilderness on their own with very little equipment. Spartans had conquered a big swath of territory around Sparta and enslaved the local inhabitants, who were called helots. The helots were understandably very upset about this and were a constant security threat to the Spartans. The Spartans had something called the crypteia, which seems like the secret thing, where boys were sent out into the countryside. Their goal was to go terrorize the helots. The movie 300 tends to glorify the Spartans and tell the really positive side of the story about how brave and well-trained they were, what great soldiers they were. There's a lot of truth in that. It doesn't tell the story of the regular oppression and violence that the Spartans used to control the helots. Agio Hanch.
I honestly believe, though, I understand the comment that he made, but then again, 300 is specifically focused as a movie onto the battle. I don't know if in this case, I mean, if it was a movie called Sparta, then I would agree with the professor's remark. I would say, yeah, to be more historically accurate, I mean, you know me. But a movie that is specifically focused on the battle, it's going to show the battle rather than everything else. I mean, we could find so many things that they didn't show that has to do with Spartan life, the way people were treated. There's so much we could say, citizenship, but then again, I mean, it would be an infinite list. I don't know if it's fair. I mean, again, I'm not very fair oftentimes, but come on, they're bodybuilders. They go naked into battle. Where's the bronze?
If Alexander the Great was so great, why did he die at 32? Alexander was great. I'm not sure we can make fun of him for dying at age 32. He didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. Going backwards a little bit, Alexander started fighting in major battles very early, around age 16. By the time he was 32, he had been wounded at least a dozen times.
That is because he actually fought hand in hand. And that is one of the things that I admire the most about Alexander the Great, that he wasn't a political leader. He was a fighter, like someone to a point that he would put himself in arms. What's the expression in English? Well, you'll tell me in the comments. Many times. And he was very dangerously challenging. Maybe also because he came to believe this idea that he was divine at one point, since everybody kept telling him that, including when he went to Egypt. But then again, in the temples, he was very courageous and up to a fault, perhaps.
So he wasn't like he was in great shape physically. He had been fairly beaten up over the course of his relatively short lifetime. Like many Macedonians, Alexander spent a lot of time doing a lot of heavy drinking. And so when he died from malaria, Alexander had been drinking heavily for the previous 3 or 4 days. He'd been wounded repeatedly. He had some serious alcohol issues. And if you combine that with the malaria, you can see why he might have died young.
And also, when it comes to Alexander, I don't think we would define a person to be great or not based on how young they died. Not an influential factor, really, is it?
At by Brandon White wants to know, was there a huge outdoor statue of Athena in the ancient Greek Acropolis like in Assassin's Creed?
Okay, this is a good one.
Yeah, there was a gigantic statue. This clip is actually a really good reconstruction of the Acropolis around, say, like 440 BCE. The Acropolis was a big rock in the middle of the city where the major religious sanctuaries were. On top of that rock was a huge bronze statue that had been made by the sculptor Phidias showing Athena. This statue was called the Athena Promachos, battle-ready Athena. We can see on the left side one of the temples called the Erechtheion, and on the right side, the Parthenon. We have this idea sometimes that Greek temples were all pure white, but we actually know that's not true. The Greeks loved painting their temples. They used a special wax-based paint, and especially bright blue and bright red. The reason why we might think these temples are white is that most of the paint has flaked off.
And to add to that, it's the same with the statues. So statues both in the Roman and Greek world were in full color and they were painted. We know that. I'm going to show on screen a few examples. But just to let you know that a lot of the time we can still see the remaining pigment, and other times, even if it's not visible, we can see with the usage of modern technology the sort of pigments that otherwise would be invisible to the naked eye because of the state of preservation. But then again, these are thousands of years old. But yeah, everything would have been in color is absolutely correct. But one thing that I want to add is, even though the statues would have been in full color, not the bronze statues. So the statues made of stone would have been painted, but the statues made of bronze or metal in general wouldn't be. And in fact, they would use different types of bronze in order to create a polychromatic effect, because, you know, depending on what type of bronze or depending on the actual constituents of the bronze, the final color that the metal or the alloy will have will vary. And I have a dedicated video to this if you want to check it out. I think one of my best, link in the description below. So bronze is an essential element of our imagination when we think of Spartan warriors, Athenians, Roman Republican military, also statues. We think of shields, weapons, swords, spears. But what color is it? Bronze has a variety of color shades that are dependent on alloy composition and particularly on the percentage of tin present. And that's for tin bronze. We're not even talking about arsenical bronze, the more ancient type, because I've already talked about it on this video. One more link. When it comes to the look of bronze in the classical age, yellow bronze would have been more common for weapons and armor, particularly if compared with more modern bronze, 92% copper, 8% tin. As the physical and mechanical properties of the bronze, as well as its surface color, would evolve and change according to its composition, and the proportions of copper and tin varied widely, as demonstrated by the data accrued through hundreds and hundreds of period specimens through physiochemical analyses based on archaeometric methodologies, such as XRF spectrometry and XRF imaging, in order to establish the chemical composition of ancient alloys.
At Existential Comms asks, actually, according to the ancient Greeks who invented Western civilization, everyone should each other all the time. Okay, well, yeah, maybe. So Greeks were very big on being married. So the assumption was that every adult, male or female, would be married. That doesn't mean that you only had sex with the person to whom you were married. So especially for men, also had an active sexual life in addition to that. The Greeks were very open to same-sex relationships. So for them, the best form of same-sex relationship among men involved an older man who was married and had a family with a teenage boy, which we would consider to be a felony, but the Greeks thought was a good idea because the older male would serve as a mentor for the younger male in the relationship.
Of course, I'm going to let him continue, but I do have something to say. Quite a few things to say, in fact, but I want to let him finish, so I give him a chance to explain.
So the same thing held true for women. It was perfectly acceptable, at least in some times and places in the Greek world, for a married woman to have a sexual relationship with a teenage girl. And we have some poetry written by a woman named Sappho with two women expressing their sexual desire for each other.
Okay, since he's closing it at this, then unfortunately I have to say the professor did not do a good job at all. In fact, if anything, he's helping spreading a myth. Is it true that there were some Greeks that thought that absolutely they would have been a lot more open to same-sex relations and all that? Yes, it's true. Did all Greeks think that? No. It's insane to me that people keep repeating this like it's the fact, although then again, I have to start believing now, because I mean, multiple times it becomes a pattern. I have to start believing that this is a requirement from Wired. Like, unless you say this, you don't get featured on Wired. So they would never feature me. Good. Here's the thing. Anyone who is familiar with the sources knows that there were people that were in favor of same-sex attraction, same-sex relationships, even though, once again, relationships in period wouldn't be the same as homosexual relationships today. As he said, people were expected to get married and have children, regardless of whether you would be homosexual or not. Once again, people didn't identify with their sexuality. It's a completely different world, the world of the classical period. And clearly, you couldn't have an open boyfriend. You couldn't marry in the same sex situation. So were they really very open? Well, I mean, not really, if you look at it this way. But they were more open than medieval church. Yes, they weren't that open. Now, once again, there are some writers, there are some philosophers, there are some poets that we read, people of importance, that do advocate this idea of a sexual aspect of pederasty, although then again, pederasty wasn't always sexual. Sometimes it was sexual, sometimes it wasn't. But there are some people that advocate for that. There are also people that are completely neutral about it. They don't care. They don't care. And I think that would have represented the majority of people. So like, yes, something is happening. It's not happening around me. Probably I don't even know about it, or if I did know about it, it's something that the elites do. I don't care. I just want to farm my land. I think a lot of people would have been like that. There might have been people that were just live and let live. Yeah, you do whatever you want. I don't care. And then there would have been people that were vehemently against. And I don't understand why these professors keep skipping that. It's all over the sources. Now, can I tell you what was the highest percentage with more people in favor of homosexual relationships, we can call them that way, or were there more people against it? It's really difficult to say because, of course, we have access to what we have access. Maybe, only maybe, if the Library of Alexandria hadn't been burnt to the ground, perhaps we could have answered this question, which personally I would have found interesting regardless of what the answer was. I am not invested in it at all. I don't care because I don't have to play by the rules of Wired, so I only play by the rules of the truth. So if the truth is, look, we have recovered so much information now, and we know that it was only a small little fraction of people that were actually against homosexuality, and some of these, as I say, vehemently against it, even calling it a sort of illness, if you will, which I know will resonate with some people today that are very hateful towards. I'm a live and let live guy. I don't hate anyone, but I hate when the truth is not fully expanded and explained. So I'm just gonna tell it how it is, and this professor is not doing it. He's giving once again this impression that all Greeks in all city-states, even though each city-state has different jurisdiction when it comes to this, even though there are specifically different laws, even though we know for a fact that there are people that mentioned bodyguards to protect the kids from the adults that were exploiting them. Like, it is what it is. It was contested. If you compare it to the modern period, they were not as open as people are today. You could not be gay and get married. Today you can, hence automatically today is more open when it comes to homosexuality and homosexual individuals. And the only way in which you can say they were quite open-minded if you compare it to the medieval Christian world. And that's the truth. I'll repeat it. Wired. See if they're gonna copyright claim this video now. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.
At AndyDoodle56. So, why am I being assigned to read some long-ass poem written by the dad from The Simpsons? The dad from The Simpsons is Homer Simpson, and so what we're thinking about here is Homer. Homer was a very famous Greek poet around 700 BCE, and he wrote two very long poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad's a story about war, but really telling the story of Achilles, who's the big hero in the poem. Achilles knows that he has very short time to live. And he spends a lot of time thinking, like, if you know you're going to die, what is worth living for? That's a big question pretty much every human being has to face, and Homer in the Iliad tries to give you some answers. The Odyssey is about someone named Odysseus coming home from war, and what is it like to come home from a war and try to reestablish your family life? At one point, a goddess offers to make him immortal as long as he stays with her, and Odysseus says, listen, I gotta go home. My wife and child are waiting. I have to be home, even if it costs me my life.
Which is a very family-oriented type of literature, if you will. What that tells me is that the Greeks were very much about the importance of family.
The reason your teachers are going to sign these things in part is because they're really important documents about how ancient Greeks thought and saw the world, but also because they're asking us important questions and encouraging us to think about things that you're going to have to think about at some point sooner or later.
I wonder, and this, of course, I'm not trying to strawman anyone, but I'm just going to present it. I don't know it for a fact, but I'm saying I wonder if another requirement in order to be featured on Wired is to use BCE CE instead of AD BC. Well, I'll say AD BC until the day I'm dead. To each his own, freedom of speech.
At Golden Yofa asks, what's worse, the fact that my draft folder was deleted or the burning of the Library of Alexandria? What's in your draft folder would be a great question. Maybe there's something really profound in there that the world is now going to miss and can't be reproduced. Alexander the Great conquered big stretches of territory, including Egypt. 200 or 300,000 Greeks emigrated. They were worried about losing their Greek culture, so they built a big Greek cultural center in Alexandria in Egypt. And part of that cultural center was a big, very famous library, which eventually was destroyed. There's a lot of stories that the Library of Alexandria burned down at some point. The modern scholarship now thinks that the library never really got burnt. It just sort of fell apart over the course of time because it wasn't properly maintained. The exact details are not very well known, but it collected a huge number of very valuable books. So I'm going to guess that the Library of Alexandria collectively was probably more important than your draft folder.
I agree.
Sorry to say that. At Wilster asks, why did the ancient Greeks place a coin in the mouth of those who died? After you died, you went under the earth to the underworld. In order to get to the underworld, you had to cross a river. And if you didn't cross that river into the underworld, you were doomed to wander the earth forever as an unhappy ghost. You had to take a ferry, and you had to pay the guy who was running the ferry, so you put a coin in the mouth of the dead person, so when they got to the river, they could pay the ferryman. At Faisal El Anwar 51, who do you think was the best ancient Greek philosopher? I'm going to have to give it to the man himself, Diogenes. You have to love Diogenes. He was a Greek philosopher committed to living a radically simple life. He owned nothing except a cup. He lived in a barrel by the side of the road. But speaking purely for myself, I would say Aristotle. He went to Athens to study with Plato, and later in his life, he was the tutor for Alexander the Great. He thought about every subject you can possibly imagine, from marine biology to political systems. He thought very carefully about what are the traits that make you behave well, that make you into a valuable, good person. At Eric Bukel asks, how did ancient Greece elect leaders?
By the way, to add to that he said, some of these morals, by the way, particularly the ones that are mentioned by, for instance, Socrates, as you read the classics, are very much the idea of resisting sexuality, resisting impulses, and reaching a higher degree of love that is not based on the passions of the flesh. So that's also something that the Greeks believed, just so that we have a full picture.
into a valuable, good person. At Eric Bukel asks, how did ancient Greece elect leaders? Ancient Greece is a big place. There are lots of different communities, and every community had its own government, and it changed over the course of time. The one we know the most about is Athens and its democratic government that started around 500 and lasted to about 300.
Of course, it's pure democracy, so it's different to the form of democracy that we have today in modern society, even though it shares the same name, two different things.
Their view was that as soon as you set up an electoral system, people with power and wealth will always find a way to game the system to get themselves elected so that the rich will always dominate the government if you hold elections. Their solution was to pick most of their leaders through a lottery system. So Athenian democracy was direct democracy. In the modern day United States, we elect a representative. Representatives goes to Washington and votes for us. But in Athens, everyone went to the legislative assembly themselves and voted for themselves. Most of the population of Athens, the simple majority, could not participate. No women were allowed to participate in government in any way, shape, or form. They couldn't vote and they couldn't hold political office. You also know that there was a significant population of enslaved persons in Athens. They couldn't participate either. And if you had immigrated to Athens, you were not going to be allowed to participate in the government also.
Yeah, you had to be a citizen. I really wonder, and this is, I'm very critical of extremism on both sides of the political spectrum. One thing that I often do not understand, and I wish you could help me, I've spoken about this in the past, is this fixation that we sometimes have with political correct terminology. Some words I understand, hate. I'm not a fan of hateful words at all. I don't use them. I'm a very polite individual. I wouldn't prohibit them by law, but the same way I don't prohibit the word shit or bitch. So I'm definitely strongly against the concept of hate speech. But what is there to gain by calling someone enslaved instead of slave? It's still a horrible thing. So I don't see, once again, might be another requirement from Wired. But I'm just wondering, what's the purpose? It's like when you say, no, don't use foreign, you have to say international people. I always fail to understand these. I hope that this is not what people will remember about our world in the future, or they got offended over everything.
Not every Greek community was a democracy, and even Athens was not a democracy for all of its history.
True.
Before the democracy, they were governed by a general who would seize power through a military coup, and other Greek communities at different times and places had pretty much every kind of government that you can imagine. Kings and narrow oligarchies where there were just like 30 people in charge. There were federal states. Another really interesting facet of Athenian government is they loved the courts, but they thought that in order to get a just judgment in a courtroom, you needed to have a really big jury. So the smallest jury that the Athenians used was 501 people. And for the really important cases, they sat juries of 6,000 people. At Geek God Review, how much do we know about the original Olympics in ancient Greece? We know a lot about the original Olympics in ancient Greece. The Greeks took their sports really seriously. They used the Olympics as their calendar. Like, what's the date? What year is it? So it's the third year of the 42nd Olympiad. The ancient Olympics had a pretty limited program of events, 3 or 4 running events. There were some horse racing events, the pentathlon, which was like a multi-sport event that tested different disciplines. If you won at Olympia, there was a grove of trees at Olympia of wild olive trees that was sacred to Zeus. And the idea was they cut a branch off the sacred tree and put it on your head. So it was kind of a gift from Zeus. The stadium at Olympia in its final form seated about 50,000 people. 50,000. And they came from all over the Mediterranean because the Greeks lived out in what's now Spain and North Africa and southern Russia. If you were a painter or a writer, or you wanted to sell something, you could show up at the Olympics and recite your work aloud, or show your paintings or your sculpture, or sell something that you had made that you wanted to market. In addition to the sports, there was a big religious element. The Olympia was actually a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus Olympios, Zeus who lives on Mount Olympus. On the third day of the Olympics, they would have a sacrifice where they killed 100 cows, a huge all-day-long barbecue that included a lot of drinking. So the ancient Olympics must have been a crazy scene.
That would have been fun. I mean, imagine. That is one of the things that I would like to go and see. Maybe first I would like to see an ancient battle, one of the famous ones, possibly involving the Romans. But then another thing that I would love to see, of course, Macedonian phalanx in action, the Olympics. Oh my gosh, that would be fantastic. 50,000. Could you imagine that? In a world where the cities did not have the sort of population sizes that we do today. And yet, for such an event, because of course, if they build a stadium that is about an arena that is able to sit so many people, it means that that's the amount of people that they are expecting, if not more. Right? Just out of deductive logic.
Mr. Mzungu, what did the Greeks invent?
Oh,
Greeks
gosh.
invented all sorts of
Good
interesting
luck.
things, but quite possibly the thing that's had the most long-term significance is the alphabet. This shows some letters from an ancient Greek inscription from Athens.
Nice.
People had writing systems for a long time all across the Near East, but around 775, the Greeks were out in that part of the world and encountered a alphabet that was being used by the Phoenicians that had consonants but no vowels. The Greeks looked at that and said, well, this would be a lot more useful if it had vowels as well. This way, if you combine the letters, you can make any sound.
Interestingly enough, that's typical of a lot of languages. The way Egyptian hieroglyphs were written were only consonant-based when it comes to the pronunciation, and you had to add the vowels that, of course, if you're a speaker of ancient Egyptian, you would have known, but clearly now it's a little difficult to recreate, which is why we've got vowels of reference. Then again, or convention, vowels of convention. It's similar, even the Bible, it's written only with the consonants, and even though with the Masoretic code they are added, so now if you read a Bible now in Hebrew, it has little dots which represent vowels. The original text was not written with vowels, it was only consonant. And that's true for a lot of Semitic languages and a lot of the ancient languages. I myself wonder why. Maybe because they didn't think that you really needed to. It would be similar to the idea of writing HS and knowing that it's house, that you need to add the vowel sounds. But if you see it so many times, at the end of the day, you'll be able to read it anyways. Maybe that's what it is.
The Romans picked up that alphabet directly from the Greeks, so our alphabet that we use every day is a direct descendant from that invention the Greeks used in 775. And that's had a huge impact because the alphabet made it much easier to learn how to read and write and made mass literacy possible. At C. Priyanka 82 asks, if you were thrown back into ancient Greece, what would you most enjoy doing for entertainment? So the Athenians, starting around 500 BCE, started putting on plays called tragedies.
Yeah.
And those plays are still very famous today. They were all put on in the same theater in Athens, the Theater of Dionysus, at a big festival every spring. And they were elaborate productions with masks and costumes, normally 2 or 3 or 4 actors on the stage, plus a chorus, which is a group of 12 or 15 people who sang and danced. So it was more like an opera than a modern play. In addition to those tragedies, there were a whole different kind of plays also performed in the same theater called comedies. The most famous playwright for the Athenian comedies was someone named Aristophanes. The tragedies were very serious plays in serious language about serious subjects. And the comedies were much more everyday sort of sitcom things.
Yeah, and one thing about that, even today, I mean, if you look at the modern Sicilian city of Syracuse or Syracusa, where I've been several times, and you still see the beautiful, gorgeous Greek amphitheaters where they would play these plays and in period, but of course they still use them today and you can visit them, and Syracuse is still famous for this sort of events. But one thing that I want to say is
also performed in the same theater called comedies. The most famous playwright for the in the same theater called comedies also performed play in addition to the. So it was more like an opera than a modern play, which is a group of.
But of course, in period, like even today, when we imagine it, this sounds really fun, but in period, it would have been spectacular because at the end of the day, it's not like you had a lot of other options when it comes to public entertainment. I mean, sure, the Romans loved gladiatorial games or like racing, and again, you had the Olympics, but this would be great for for people that don't have TV, for people that are used that when it's nighttime, you kind of want to go to bed, you don't have electricity, you can use candlelight, but then again, it's different. It's a different world. So within this world, one can only imagine why people loved these so much, because they gave them something to do that was really, really fun and special.
Gods were said to live on Mount Olympus, a specific and easily accessible location in Greece. Did anyone go and check? Well, they could have. Certainly, it's a big, very prominent mountain in Greece. You can walk to the top. Greeks definitely went up there. There was, at the base of the mountain, a big sanctuary to Zeus. And the way the Greeks thought about this, like what's the highest point that they knew about, which was the top of Mount Olympus, and was sort of like a metaphor for living up in the heavens. Greek religion is very different than our modern day monotheistic religions in a whole number of different ways. One is that the Greeks believed in lots and lots of gods. They were polytheistic. The prime example of a god would be Zeus, right? So Zeus is born from gods. He's always a god. But there were also figures who were born mortal and then lingered on after they died in some special sense and continued to have some power after they died. Those are heroes. Heracles is the great example of the Greek hero. Zeus is his father, but he has sex with a mortal woman and gives birth to Heracles. Heracles goes out and does all these amazing feats.
Then again, it's true that polytheism and monotheism are very, very different. Clearly, the Greek gods have very much of a physical component, but that's not only different when compared to monotheistic religions such as Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but it's different even from the Roman version of the gods, because the Romans believed that the gods were more of an invisible force, whereas the Greeks had very much of a physical approach to the deities, which I think is very interesting. Of course, when I say that about the Romans, I'm generalizing. That wouldn't apply to every single Roman or the entirety of the population, but when we read, we do see sometimes this difference. Interestingly though, if you look at what he just mentioned, the hero that is half mortal because his mother is human, but his father is a god, and so that makes him kind of a hero. It's not too different if you really think about it from the idea of Christianity having God, and then you have Mary, who is a human that is used to give birth to Christ.
As a result, he becomes a hero and lives on after he's dead. So from the Greek perspective, it was possible to become a hero. Their view was that the gods and heroes were always among them, were always moving around and always present in a much more personal and immediate sense than we would think about in the modern world. At Values wants to know, how did ancient Greece begin? Well, we need to start by getting the Greeks into Greece. Where Greece is now is the Greek homeland, the sort of southern end of the Balkan Peninsula. We think the Greeks arrived there around 2200 BCE. There had been people living in this area for a very long time before that. This is a replica of a painting from Crete from around 1600 BCE by a group that we call the Minoans. And we know that the Minoans didn't speak Greek, and they had been there for a long time before the Greeks got there. So the Greeks arrive in Greece in what we call the Bronze Age, a period when the big metal that people were using on a regular basis for everything was bronze. And the Bronze Age lasts all the way down to around 1200 BCE. So at the later part of the Bronze Age, on the Greek mainland, the Greek itself, there was a civilization called the Mycenaeans. Mycenaeans are a very rigidly hierarchical system. When that system burnt down, the Greeks went back to a much more egalitarian system. And then by the time we get down to around 500 BCE, that trajectory has resulted in the Greeks building the first democracies. So this is a real turning point where the history of Greece sort of changes direction in a fundamental way. And there's a period between 500 and 300 BCE, which we typically call the classical period, when things were going really well in the Greek world. And a lot of the people and buildings that you hear about, Parthenon, Pericles, Socrates, the great playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, all Thucydides, the great historian, all those people come from Athens in this very limited time span. And then the reason that 200 is a possible endpoint is that around 200 BCE, the Greeks were conquered by the Romans. At Azadeth 311 asks, did Greece have an empire?
I also have a dedicated video to Romans versus Greece and how the Romans beat the Greek. So if you're interested, link in the description.
Empire? Did they have an empire, bro? Greece is a complicated subject because the Greeks lived all over the Mediterranean. So the Greek homeland is where Greece is now, right down here at the southern end of the peninsula. And so we know the Greeks got there around 2200 BCE. But not long thereafter, they started spreading out. And so all the dark blue on this map are areas where the Greeks migrated in and built themselves communities. And so there were thousands of separate Greek communities all over the Mediterranean. They were never all part of a single state. For instance, Alexander the Great ran all of Greece and then all of this area out here, but his empire never included the Western Mediterranean. So the Greeks really didn't have an empire in the sense like the Romans built a single empire that everyone lived in.
Good
Batterfish
answer.
Blog asks, the School of Athens by Raphael depicts the greatest thinkers of ancient Greece. When was there truly a golden age? Well, let's start by looking at the actual picture. So this is painted by Raphael much later than ancient Greece, obviously. And it's Raphael's idea about all the great figures of ancient Greece being in the same place at the same time.
Okay, I'm interested in this one because it is my name. My name in Italian is Raffaello. Raffaello, exactly like the painter from Urbino, the city of Urbino, Raffaello Sanzio. It's actually not a very common name in our day and age. Usually there is a more common version that is Raffaele, and that's the one that we usually connect directly to the archangel. Although then again, the archangel in Hebrew is Raphael, so they both originate from that. Regardless, Raffaello, I thought in English would be pronounced Raphael. So he says Raphael. Which one is it? Let me know because I'm kind of interested in this. How do you pronounce my name in English?
Same time. We've got Plato here and Aristotle standing next to him. You've got our old friend Diogenes, and over here is Socrates, who was Plato's teacher. So was there a golden age? Athens had a real golden age between around 480, 500 when they were inventing democracy down to around 300 BCE. In that time and place, there were lots of famous writers, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, Thucydides. The single most famous Greek building is easily the Parthenon, this temple built in Athens just about this time. So if you were going to pick a golden age in ancient Greece, it would almost certainly be Athens in this 200-year time span between roughly 500 and 300. Cliff O'Reilly asks, don't forget that the ancient Greeks had no rice, no pasta, no tomatoes, and no potatoes. What did they eat? The Greeks subsisted largely on three things. Olives, grapes in the form of wine, and some sort of grain, either barley or wheat. The Mediterranean is actually a very warm body of water, and it's not a great place to fish for the most part. And they did...
What? Go tell that to the Sicilians. I'm a part of. I don't know why he would say that. There is a lot of fishing that happens in the Mediterranean even today. I wonder why he said that. That really baffles me.
Didn't have a lot of livestock, and so they didn't eat a lot of meat either. James Hawk 1 asks, how did the Greeks know they lived on a planet in outer space? There are lots of ancient Greeks who had different opinions on this, but the high-end scholars who thought about this a lot had a very clear idea about how things work. They spent a lot of time observing the stars. They inherited some knowledge from the ancient Near East, and they spent a lot of time doing fancy math. The Greek mathematician Aristophanes, around 275 BCE, calculated the circumference of the Earth within a high degree of accuracy. So some Greeks were very much aware that we live on a spherical body in outer space.
Interestingly enough, so were the medieval elites, contrary to popular belief. This idea that all medieval people were flat earthers is nonsense. The reality is that the learned elites, who could read the Greeks, by the way, and the church knew that the earth was a sphere. In fact, we see that in a lot of representation when you have like a statue of a king or an emperor, and then you see that he's holding a sphere as a representation of the planet in the medieval period. It would have been, and when it comes to the average, the masses in the medieval period, would they have known? No, most likely. But then again, it's because they didn't care. It didn't affect their life. So people that weren't very educated probably wouldn't have thought anything of it. Go tell that to the Sicilians.
The repression and violence.
I'm very critical of extremism on both sides of the political spectrum.
The Greeks were very open to same-sex relationships. So for them, the best form of same-sex relationship, an older man who was married and had a family with a teenage boy.
It's all over the sources. And I don't understand why
the community would identify someone who was a real threat.
I don't care, because I don't have to play by the rules of Wired. So I only play by the rules of the truth.
So they would
and
use
that's the
broken
truth.
pieces
I'll
of
repeat
pottery,
it. Wired. See if they're going to
ostraka.
copyright claim this
You could
video
write
now.
down the name of any person you wanted, and sometimes add an insult too. Get rid of Megacles, that guy who likes the Persians too much, and then they would collect them all up and count them. A lot of the time what happened was there were two political factions in town, and they couldn't come to an agreement. The leader of one of those factions would get thrown out of town for 10 years, and that made the decision.
Yeah, there are a few people that I can think of I would absolutely use that against.
Slane asks, what do Greek columns represent? Greek columns came in basically three flavors. So this is Doric, and that's Ionic, and that's Corinthian, and each one had a very particular cap. If you're in any big city, especially like Washington, D.C., you're going to see lots of these Greek-style capitals around. There's a reason for that. It's like
I actually have a few columns in my home. Maybe I'll show you sometime.
Around 1750, the people, especially in Germany and England, looked at the remains of the ancient Greek buildings and drew them in really very high level of detail. And so just around 1800, it became very stylish to put up buildings that look like Greek buildings. Yes. And that's exactly when Washington, D.C. was being built, just when this architectural craze was happening. So those are all the questions for today. Thanks for watching.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor. A few things I disagreed, but overall, the presentation was good. I just wonder why there are some things that just have become politically correct to only be shown in a certain way. But at the end of the day, I really wonder, out of curiosity, how we got to a point where we went through all of this political correctness, this terminology, I don't like it, it offends me, and that's that. I mean, at the end of the day, I can be free to follow it, not follow it, and you can be free to use it. I mean, if that's what you want, great, as long as you don't force me. I don't have a big problem with what sort of language you choose to use, but I do have a problem when that sort of level of what is acceptable is going to be influencing the truth. Like, the truth is not acceptable, so we're not going to tell it that way. That's when you're going to have a problem with me. And that's why I'm going to keep making these videos, to protect the truth. All right, thank you very much, noble ones, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.